Hello, I'm Tina Eck, and I'm the president of Seattle Indivisible. And I am so happy to personally welcome you to our training on how to register voters in Washington State. So let's get started. Registering voters in Washington State is actually pretty easy. You can do it electronically, you can do it on paper, or people can actually go down to the elections department and register in person right through election day. But the deadline for you to help people register is either electronically or on paper is 8 days before the election. That means October 26th. We have to complete all of our registrations in order to have them be able to vote in the general election, which this year is November 3, 2020, a critical election. In order to be eligible to vote in Washington State, you must be a U.S. citizen. You have to be age 18, but you can pre-register as early as age 16. You must be a resident of Washington State, and we'll talk in a minute what that means. And you must not be disqualified by a court order. So the first two are pretty self-explanatory. Let's talk about the residency requirement and the disqualification requirement. So how do you know whether or not you're a legal resident of Washington State? Typically, that means that you live in Washington and you plan to stay here. You're not just visiting. Technically, you're supposed to have lived here for the last 30 days right before an election that you intend to vote in. For college students, snowbirds, or others who live in more than one state, you can still register in Washington. If you live here part of the time, you just need to choose which state you register in because you can only be registered in one state. So if you're a college student and you live in Washington and you go to school out of the state, you can register in Washington. Or if you normally live out of state but are going to university in Washington State, you also can register in Washington. It's your choice. And it is perfectly okay to register in Washington State because you're a resident, but then have your ballot sent to an out-of-state mailing address, which we talk about that in a minute too. If you're a U.S. citizen who lives out of the country, you can register to vote in Washington if you last lived in Washington before you moved to that other country. So now you're a U.S. citizen, the person is at least 16 years old, they're a resident of Washington State, but they have to not be disqualified by a court. There's two situations that comes up. The first is for mental incompetence. You're probably not going to see this very often, but we do sometimes see it if we're registering voters in nursing homes, which we do sometimes. So just because somebody has a guardianship does not necessarily mean that they can't vote. It depends on what the court order says. So you're not lawyers, you're not going to be interpreting this for them, but you can tell them that. They can still register to vote depending on what their court order says about their level of incompetence. It's never okay for somebody else to vote for you. So if somebody has your power of attorney, it does not mean they get to vote for you. Many people incorrectly think that they can't vote if they have a prior felony conviction. So that is something that you need to set them straight about. First, remember that you only lose your right to vote if you have an adult felony conviction. So juvenile convictions do not impact your voting rights. And misdemeanor convictions don't impact your voting rights. It's only an adult felony conviction. But after you've paid your debt, then your right to vote is automatically restored in Washington State by law. So if you are convicted in federal court or in another state other than Washington, your right to vote in Washington is automatically restored once you're released from prison. If you're convicted in Washington State court, your right to vote is automatically restored once you're no longer under the supervision or authority of the Department of Corrections. In other words, like you're done with parole and probation. You do need, even though your right to vote is automatically restored by law, you do need to re-register to vote. I suggest that you take the pamphlet. There's a pamphlet here that the ACLU has put out with some great information for people who have a felony conviction on their record. Here is what the pamphlet looks like. I always take 2 or 3 of these pamphlets with me when I'm registering voters. It is just a joy when you're able to tell somebody who thinks that for life they can't vote, that indeed they can. And I've experienced that, and I would highly recommend that you take these pamphlets with you. It makes a big difference in people's lives. So now we know that the person is qualified and eligible to be a voter in Washington State. So sometimes, though, they think they've already registered to vote. They're not sure. Offer to check. If you look at this website right here, or this URL address, or this QR code will take you right there. You can have the person put it on their phone, put in their name and their birth date, and it will tell you right away if they're already registered to vote. Because if they haven't voted in the last 2 federal elections, their name may have been removed, or they might just need to update their address, their name, like their name has changed, or even their signature can sometimes need to be updated because it's unrecognizable. What will that registrant need in order to register to vote? Well, if they have a Washington State driver's license number or a permit number, a Washington State identification card, a tribal identification card number, or if they don't have any of those identifications with them, then the last 4 digits of their Social Security number can be used if they're registering on paper. The first question on the voter registration form is pretty self-explanatory. It just asks for personal information, and this can be filled out in just seconds for most people who are registering to vote. They ask for your name, your birth date, and your address. Here are the things that sometimes come up as questions or concerns. First, the gender question. If they can put male, they can put female, they can put non-binary, they can put other, you can put anything you want in there, whatever you're comfortable representing your gender to be. Some people, and on the electronic registration, it actually gives you a male, female, or other choices. On the phone number and email address, it says it's optional, and it is. So some people ask, well, why would I put that in there? And the reason that the state elections department asks for that information is so that they can contact you if there's a problem either with your registration or your ballot. They can always contact you in writing by mailing it to your address, but it's quicker and more direct way to contact you if you've given a phone number or email address. So they might use that if your ballot comes in and your signature isn't validated or you forgot to sign it. It's just another way to contact you if there's a voting problem. But let's talk a little bit more about the residential address and the mailing address, because for some people there are special circumstances that make this a little bit more difficult. And again, we're in the training session, we want you to be prepared for all situations. So here's some of the questions that come up about your residential address. One is, why do they need to know where I live? Well, the elections department wants to know where you live because your actual physical location where you reside determines what precinct you vote in, and different precincts vote on different issues. Some people don't want them to know where they live. Well, the address of registered voters is public information, but if there is a serious personal safety concern, a reason for you not to want to give out your location, like you're a victim of domestic violence or stalking or something like that, you should let that person know. Do not register them to vote because it will become public information if you do. But if they have that concern, make sure you tell them that the Washington Secretary of State has an address confidentiality program that they should look into. This program isn't just for registering to vote, it's for setting up an alternative address that's confidential for any time they need to give out public address information and they don't want their address to be disclosed publicly. Here's the website you can refer them to see whether or not they qualify. What comes up more frequently is somebody who might want to register to vote, but they don't have a traditional address. Well, your residential address does not have to be a traditional address. It doesn't have to be a street number or an apartment number in Washington State in order to register. It can be anywhere you reside. So if you live on a reservation, for example, some tribes on the reservation use locator numbers or different non-traditional addresses. That will work. Or if you live in your car or your RV, the intersection or the street where you park that will work. Or list the corner or intersection of an address of a park where you sleep at night. Or you could list the address of a shelter if that's where you are. Any physical location can serve as your residential address, just to determine what issues you get to vote on. If you live in another country or only live part-time in Washington, then your legal residential address in Washington is where you last lived in Washington State. So then it asks for your mailing address. First, note that it says if different. So if your residential address where you live is also where you want your ballot to be mailed, you don't fill this out at all. But sometimes you don't want your ballot to be sent where you live, or if you have given a non-traditional address, you can't necessarily have it sent, for example, to an intersection. So here are some questions that come up about your mailing address. First, know that this is the address. Tell the person that this is the address where your ballot will be mailed. It is perfectly okay to list a mailing address in another state or another country. It's okay to list someone else's address where you might get mail, like a parent or a relative or a friend. If you're registering voters and it's a homeless potential voter, you still want to encourage them to register to vote and assure them that there are ways for them to get that ballot. One is if they have a friend or relative who can pick up the mail for them, where they can pick up the mail, they can give that address. The address, many shelters will accept mail if you're living in a shelter or any kind of temporary housing. You can send mail, you can actually receive mail by general delivery at a main post office in any city. So for example, in Seattle, the main post office is located at 3rd and Union Street. And for the mailing address, you just put your name, general delivery, Seattle, Washington, 98101-9999. General delivery mail is held for 30 days, and you must have ID in order to pick up the mail. So make sure you let them know that in case they don't have ID. Some organizations actually provide mail service. You often need photo ID in order to pick up your mail there, and the times they'll hold the mail varies. But particularly if you're registering voters in certain areas of town, you should really check to see what is the locations nearby that will accept mail. Compass House is a great place. It's right in Pioneer Square, and they actually have a full post office available. If you use this address, you can pick up the mail anytime between 9 and 4. And Ballard Food Bank is another one. There's a pamphlet right here, a downloadable pamphlet that you can use and print out and take with you and hand out to people who want more information on how to register if you're homeless. So after you provide all of that personal identifying information, you get moving on to voter registration questions 2 through 4 on the form, which are pretty straightforward. Secondly, assuring on your qualifications, you have to answer yes or no whether you're a citizen of the United States, yes or no whether or not you're at least 18 years old or at least 16 years old and aren't going to vote until you're 18. So they have to answer yes to both of those questions. And I can tell you from experience that those are the questions most often skipped, and they have to be filled out. So when you're checking over their form, make sure they answer those questions. Then number 3 asks whether you serve overseas, whether you live outside in military, or whether you live outside of the United States. Some people want to know, well, why do they want to know that? It's because special voting rules apply to you if you live outside the country or if you're serving in the military. It allows you additional time to vote, and you can vote sometimes online. So you definitely want to tell them if either of these circumstances apply to you, because you get a lot more leeway in how and when you vote. And then finally, this is the numbers that you fill out: your driver's license number, your permit number, your state ID issued number, or even your tribal identification card number. You fill out the numbers, 1 digit in each of these boxes. If they don't have any ID with them, then you can register to vote on paper by giving the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. That option is not available to you if you're registering online, but it is if you're registering on paper. One thing that comes up sometimes is people don't have their, older people might not have their reading glasses with them. They can't see the numbers on their driver's license number. You are allowed to fill out the numbers for them if they want you to. You cannot do anything after they sign the ballot, and you can't write down anything that they don't want you to. You're just being their scrivener. But if they can't read it, you can read the numbers for them. The next question is if you want to change your name or your address, which you should keep that updated on your voter registration. You use the same form that you use to register new voters, only on question number 5, you identify the former last name and the former address so that they can update that information. And then finally, the person needs to sign the voter registration and date it. And you should check and make sure that those are both done, because they need to be done in order for the registration to be validated. You can also register voters electronically. Some voters prefer electronic registration, and it's really easy for you. You don't have to carry around the forms. You don't have to worry about the weather. You don't have to turn them in at the end of your voter registration duties. You don't have to even touch anything. They can use their own, they usually use their own device to enter the information. So Seattle Indivisible has some unique voter registration URL addresses and QR codes set up for registering voters. The Secretary of State has set these links up for us, and they're specifically for Seattle Indivisible. And we really want you to use these rather than the generic King County voter registration links, because this allows us to keep track of how many people we have registered to vote and their demographics. So use these links whenever you're registering voters with Seattle Indivisible. You can register voters electronically in these 5 different languages. Here are the electronic links to get you directly to those registration locations. We have also set up QR codes that makes it even easier. They don't have to type in this address. They can just scan the QR code, and that will take you directly to the web address where you're registering voters. Why don't you give it a try? Just pause the video for a minute, take out your camera phone or whatever device you have that has a camera on it, open up the camera, and just linger in the screen and close up on this particular QR code right here. If you just focus, don't snap the shot, just focus on that. It will typically pick up that link and get you right to the link that you need to register voters. If your camera doesn't, you might not need a QR code reader, but most cameras will automatically pick up that scan. So give it a try. I'll wait a minute while you give it a try. But when we register voters, we also make sure that we give a paper option. So yes, you're going to have a clipboard, and Seattle Indivisible has clipboards for you to use. Some voters prefer to register in writing. The print's bigger. They don't have to worry about using their camera. They might not have a camera with them. They might just prefer to do it in writing. They also have a lot more language options to register voters. The forms come in 23 different languages. Electronic registration is only available in 5 languages. You also don't need to have any ID with you. You can just use the last 4 digits of your Social Security number if you're registering online. And also you have to turn in the King County elections forms, or whatever county it is, you have to turn them in within 5 days. Just so you know too, if you register somebody to vote and they don't live in King County or reside in King County, that is fine. You can still turn the forms into King County elections and they will make sure that the correct county gets the information. In other words, you don't have to segregate your pile if you have people that reside in different counties whom you've registered to vote. So registering voters online, make sure you bring the clipboard, bring an extra pens in case you run out of ink, bring the voter registration forms with you, determine which languages you were going to need. That depends a lot on which populations you're focusing on in your registration. And bring some information pamphlets with you, which we'll talk about in a minute. You get the forms either from the Seattle Indivisible group leader who's organizing the voter registration drive or agreeing to be the leader in that particular drive. They usually have forms with them, or if you're doing it on your own, you can get the forms at King County Elections Office. Their main office is in Renton, and they do have a small annex in Seattle, downtown Seattle. Or you can download the registration forms at this particular link. Sometimes you want to do that if you're just short, like a couple, like you want in a certain language. I don't recommend you trying to download all of the registration forms you're going to need, but if you just need 1 or 2, it's a great service to be able to download all the different languages at this link. If you're out registering voters, be prepared for weather. You really don't want the forms to get damaged by rain, especially after they've been completed, because they won't be legible. So bring something to put those completed forms in. Bring some kind of a plastic covering to cover your clipboard. And before the registrant walks away, make sure you've scanned the form to make sure that they've completed all of the necessary lines. You don't need to check the accuracy of anything. In fact, you shouldn't be checking their ID or checking their citizenship status or anything like that. They're the ones swearing to the accuracy, not you. But just make sure that they've completed it, because if they've left something out, then their registration won't be able to be completed, and it will just take more time because the elections department's going to have to contact them to follow up. So take all of your completed forms, and usually you will give them back to the group, Seattle Indivisible group leader, depending on what the instructions are for that particular event. Or if you're turning them in yourself, either by mail or in person to the elections department, make sure that you include a Seattle Indivisible cover sheet. That cover sheet, and there's a link here for that, that cover sheet, which looks like this, also helps the elections department keep track of which voter registrations have come in from Seattle Indivisible, so that we can get those statistics and demographics later. When it asks the organization, you write Seattle Indivisible. Here is the Seattle Indivisible PO address. And then for the email and phone number, put in your information. Or whoever is actually turning in the forms, that should be whose information is put on that. Here are some helpful pamphlets to bring with you. You don't need a whole lot of them, depending on the size of the event in which you're registering voters. But these are all pamphlets that I have found really useful, both to give out for information or for special voting circumstances. Always bring these pamphlets with you. This is a guide to voting in King County. This is available in dozens of different languages from the King County Elections Department. And again, you can get those pamphlets usually from the person organizing, at Seattle Indivisible, organizing the drive. And this pamphlet is even more detailed, telling you who all of your elected officials are in Washington State, their terms. It basically gives you a civics lesson. So while this first pamphlet is telling you the details about voting, the second one is telling you the details about who your representatives are, what their terms are, and their contact information. It's a full pamphlet, many pages. This third one is the pamphlet that we talked about a moment ago, details on how to vote with a felony conviction on your record. And then this final one is a printout pamphlet that has been produced for people who don't have a house or a traditional address and still want to vote. It gives you details and some locations that will accept mail for you. So these final two are printouts, the felony conviction one and the homeless ones. At this address, you can look them up. You can print them out, double-side printing, and then fold them. It's meant to be distributed that way. These first two are more complicated. They're longer and they're more detailed and intricate in their printing. So you'll want to get those either from the person who set up the Seattle Indivisible voter registration event, or you can get them from King County Elections and the League of Women Voters. Here are a few useful tips for registering voters. One, remember that Seattle Indivisible voter registration events are nonpartisan. So don't ever ask anyone what their party affiliation is or what candidates they favor, and don't tell them yours. This isn't about trying to get certain people to register to vote if you like the way they're going to vote. They're nonpartisan events, meaning they're not affiliated with either of the political parties. If they ask you a question about Seattle Indivisible and want to know more about Seattle Indivisible, it's perfectly all right for you to answer their questions, refer them to our website if you wish. It's okay to tell them that we're a progressive organization, but we're not affiliated with any political party or any particular candidate. Be friendly, be engaging, be helpful. You want people to be able to feel comfortable talking to you, and you want to be able to be helpful to them by providing information that they may have questions about. Before you get started, especially for the first time, it helps to have a quick opening line in mind. And again, that depends somewhat in the environment in which you're going to be registering voters. For example, if you're standing outside a grocery store entrance, people are going to be rushing in and out. So you want to have a quick opening line like register to vote today, register or update your voter registration, you know, something like that, just something really quick. Feel free to assure them that it will only take 2 minutes of their time, because literally that is all the time it takes for most people to register to vote. Be sensitive and be tactful in the questions that you ask, particularly if someone is hesitant to register to vote or they think that they can't register to vote. Because as we discussed a moment ago, some people incorrectly think that they can't register to vote, like if they have a felony conviction on their record, or maybe they're uncertain about their citizenship status. Don't say, for example, well, why? Why are you concerned? Do you have a felony conviction? I mean, that would be very insensitive. Don't question their citizenship. Don't raise anything like that. But it is helpful if they say they can't register to vote, for you to take it one step further and say, well, is there something that I can help you with? Because Washington voter laws have changed in recent years, and actually a lot more people can vote now than used to be able to. So let me know if there's anything I can help you with. And that invites them to tell you what their issue is. Like, for example, if they do have a prior conviction that they're concerned about, but don't pry, don't go further than that. Be ready to share a story, a short story about why voting makes a difference, because you will come across a number of people who are disenfranchised. They'll say, it doesn't matter, I don't vote because it doesn't matter, my vote doesn't count, what's the difference? So one story, for example, in 2018, do you know that the entire legislature in Virginia, whether it was going to be controlled by Democrats or Republicans, was determined by a single vote? Or a number of years ago, there was a local election in Washington, a sheriff's election, that was decided by a single vote. So every vote counts, and that could not be more true than it is in 2020. So feel free to share those or other stories you have about why it's personally important to you that people vote. Be aware that most people you were encountered are already going to be registered to vote. So be prepared to update or inform them about the election. Use it as a time to say, yeah, our election's coming up in the first week of November. Make sure you're ready. But just to temper your own expectations, know that it's very common to spend a couple hours registering voters, but to only have, you know, a handful of voters, a new voter registrations, sometimes fewer. So, but you're out there, you're informing people, you're making them think about the election, and all of that is helpful, and you've shown that that kind of engagement actually increases the likelihood that people are going to vote. Next tip, I call it closing the deal. There are a lot of people who are busy. They'll say, oh, just hand me a form and I'll fill it out later. Last resort, do that, but first try to get them to do it right there, because it's been shown that half the time when they take the form, they won't fill it out and complete it. They'll put it in a pile somewhere at home and it won't get turned in. So if they say, I'm in a rush, you know, just give me a form, say, well, really, it'll only take 2 minutes or something like that. And then if they're hesitant, go ahead. I mean, if they're going to walk away otherwise, give them the form. If they are doing it on paper, make sure you check for completeness. If they're doing it electronically, obviously you can't hold them there, but feel free to wait while they're doing it in case they have a question that comes up, which they sometimes do. And then in the end, thank them for registering to vote and tell them what comes next. They'll be getting a voter registration card in the mail, and the ballots, especially if you're registering somebody to vote near to election time, you know, tell them that the ballots are going to come out about 3 weeks before the election, and they should watch for that ballot in mail, because we do all of our voting by mail in Washington State. That's it. Now you know how to register voters in Washington, and it is really quite simple, and it's so important. Volunteers like you will help us all win in 2020. So thank you so much for participating in this webinar, and thank you for joining our voter registration team. Seattle Indivisible needs volunteers just like you.